I'm Father Jeffrey Mickler of the Society of St. Paul, a religious congregation in the Catholic Church made up of brothers and priests dedicated to spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ through the use of media. We're located in 30 countries. Today I would like to share with you a few thoughts on St. Paul's trial in Jerusalem, as recounted in the Acts of the Apostles. However, to understand that trial, you have to understand the background of history and the great sweep of empires that set in motion all of the events that took place in the Holy Land during and immediately after the life of Christ. First of all, David and Solomon brought Israel to its greatest sense of power and influence in the region. After the death of Solomon, however, things steadily declined for Israel as a nation. Immediately upon Solomon's death, the 10 northern tribes broke away, established their own kingdom, but it did not last. They were annihilated by expanding empires and disappeared from history. Judea and Benjamin stood alone for a while, but finally Babylon came, conquered Jerusalem. The people were exiled. And this is recounted in the great prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and all of tears the people of God shed during that historic epic. They lived for decades in Babylon, weeping by the streams, longing for Jerusalem. Finally, however, Babylon itself was conquered, and the Jewish people were sent home, where they tried to rebuild a nation and a kingdom, but they would always be a small part of greater empires that surrounded them. It seemed like that area was constantly contested by competing powers. Alexander the Great conquered the area, but his large empire that extended from Macedonia through northern India collapsed at his death and was broken into pieces. Jerusalem was contested by 2 competing pieces of that empire, one ruled by the Ptolemies and the other ruled by the Seleucids. Eventually, the Jewish people revolted against the Seleucid Empire because they tried to force on the Jewish people pagan practices and a pagan religion. And this great revolution is recounted in the books of Maccabees, with all of its heroism and its sorrow. Unfortunately, although they gained their independence, they could not establish a unity amongst themselves, and there was constant civil war and fighting until the Romans arrived on the scene. The Romans themselves had a great civil war that swept through the area, ending with the victory of Caesar Augustus over all of his rivals, and the establishment of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome in the territories. The Romans set up first Herod the Great as a vassal king, and upon his death they split his territory up under lesser vassal kings and rulers. This set the stage for all of the events that take place in the New Testament. In the area, the Romans were the rulers. Their governors and procurators enforced their will and the will of Rome through the use of military force. They had cohorts stationed across the territories. The cohorts were trained just like the legions, but did more garrison duty, keeping law and order wherever they were. The Romans would appoint the kings that were in charge and the lesser rulers, as well as approve or disapprove of the high priest in Jerusalem. They wanted to control and influence the social, the political, and the religious events in that very volatile area. They also gave special privileges to the Jews, and so as not to cause a disaster like the Seleucids experienced, the Romans would not bring their own standards, their own images into Jerusalem. The soldiers would always come in with their weapons and shields alone. And the people at the temple, in turn, would pray for the emperor, but never worship him as a god. This is the setting of Paul and his trial. Paul's final fateful visit to Jerusalem turned out to be quite tumultuous. He first visits the early Christian community, hands over alms to them to be distributed amongst the poor, and spends 7 days in prayer with his companions. They go up to the temple on the 7th day. And as they're entering, some pilgrim Jews from around the Mediterranean world see him and erroneously think that he has brought a Gentile into the temple. They begin to cry out, "These are the men that are preaching against our religion and our faith around the whole world." A riot breaks out. The Romans see this riot develop. They send in their troops, and the Roman tribune rescues Paul from the mob. He takes Paul to the fortress with a whole crowd of people following and shouting. Paul speaks to the tribune in Greek, and he allows Paul to address the crowd. Paul gives a summation of his entire life, but when he gets to the point of the stoning of Stephen, people begin to yell out, "Kill him! Kill him!" And the tribune decides at that point to whip the truth out of Paul and orders his flogging. But at that point, Paul says, "When is a Roman citizen flogged?" And at that point, the entire nature of the trial and the episode takes an entirely new turn. The Roman tribune ordered a trial the next day. He heard from members of the Sanhedrin and the high priest Ananias. Paul defended himself by saying, "I've acted with a clear conscience." But there was violence in the air, and the Roman tribune understood that he was dealing with a very volatile situation. And the number one rule of the Romans was to try to keep law and order and peace in the cities that they were occupying. He had a Roman citizen being accused of stirring up the people to all types of problems. His own life was on the line, because if he made the wrong mistake, it could not only end his career, but his life itself. As the shouting grew louder, and some of the scribes began to defend Paul, because Paul said he was a Pharisee that believed in the angels and other things that the Pharisees believed in, the crowd became divided. And the tribune decided to postpone making any decisions. The next night, Paul has one of his rare visions, an important one, saying, "Take courage. You are to bear witness to me in Rome." What a vision. When it was day, a very interesting passage takes place. Paul's sister, whom we know very little about, hears that there's a plot to assassinate Paul. She sends her son, his nephew, to the Romans to warn them of this plot. The Roman tribune, therefore, takes Paul and sends him under heavy guard to Caesarea.